the Seven Kingdoms, monsters are rarely born. More often, they are made slowly, behind castle walls, in places where powerful men decide what suffering matters and what suffering can be ignored. Sandor Clegane was 6 years old when his brother held his face over a brazier for touching a toy. The men around him called it an accident. That was the first lesson Sandor ever truly learned, that power protects the cruel, and the world will look away if the monster is useful enough. Before he was known as the Hound, before kings and princes used him like a weapon, Sandor was simply a child, raised beneath the shadow of Gregor Clegane, a man so completely emptied of mercy that even those who feared him chose silence over justice. The burns across Sandor's face never healed properly, but the deeper wound came afterward, in the years spent watching the people with swords and authority reward the brother who had destroyed him. What survived that childhood became hard, contemptuous, violent, and incapable of believing in the songs knights told about honor. Sandor spent most of his life tearing those songs apart, but underneath the rage, the scars, and the snarling contempt, there was still something human left alive inside him. And the story of Sandor Clegane is the story of what it cost to keep that part from dying completely. Clegane's keep sits in the Westerlands, territory sworn to House Lannister, unremarkable in almost every way a minor holding can be unremarkable. No great history, no famous battles, no songs written about its lords. It existed to serve a purpose, to provide men and swords when the lions of Casterly Rock required them. Beyond that purpose, it asked for nothing and received nothing. House Clegane was not ancient nobility. Their elevation was recent, earned through service rather than blood. A grandfather had rid the Lannister hunting grounds of a monstrous dog, and Lord Tywin's predecessor had rewarded him with land and a keep and the right to call himself a lord. The sigil they chose was 3 black dogs on yellow, an honest emblem for a family whose entire identity was built around being useful to more powerful men. Into this household, Sandor Clegane was born, the second son, younger than Gregor by several years. Gregor was already large as a child, unusually, unnervingly large, but size alone does not produce what Gregor was. Other large men became knights, soldiers, protectors. He became something the world struggled to name. He was a creature that looked like a man and spoke like a man, but seemed to operate without the mechanism that most men carry. That mechanism is the thing that registers another person's pain as a reason to stop. What Gregor did to Sandor was not ordinary sibling cruelty. It was deliberate and sustained. Sandor had been playing with a toy, a carved wooden knight, by some accounts. Gregor decided he wanted it. When Sandor would not give it up, Gregor held his younger brother's face against the burning coals of a brazier and pressed down until the skin gave way. Sandor was 6 years old. The burn covered half his face. It destroyed tissue and nerve, left him scarred from jaw to temple. It ensured that for the rest of his life, every person who looked at him would see it first. They would form their entire understanding of who he was from the evidence of what had been done to him. He would live inside that wound for decades. What happened immediately after is its own kind of mental wound. Their father reported the injury as an accident. The story told to the household was that Sandor had been playing too close to the fire. No one contradicted this. Not servants, not knights, not the maester who dressed the burns. The silence closed around the event completely. And then it gets worse. Lord Tywin Lannister learned what Gregor had done, and he made a decision. He did nothing. He covered it, absorbed it, filed it away as useful information rather than a reason for justice. Gregor was too valuable as a weapon to lose over something as inconvenient as the truth. Gregor was eventually knighted. He went on to become one of the most feared fighters in the realm. He wore the codes of honor and chivalry, like clothing draped over something that had never understood what those words meant. He murdered and raped and butchered his way through decades of Lannister service, and the rewards kept coming, because he was useful. This is the lesson Sandor absorbed while still a child, still healing. Not simply that his brother was cruel, he understood that clearly enough, but that the entire structure above him, the edifice of lordship and knighthood and vows and authority, was arranged to protect men like Gregor. It protected them from the consequences of being exactly what they were. Power did not punish the guilty. Power protected whoever was most useful, and called that protection justice. He never forgot it. The knights who swore their vows and rode in tournaments and were sung about in halls were part of the same architecture. That architecture had allowed a 6-year-old boy to burn while everyone with a sword looked away. The vows were decoration. The titles were costumes. Underneath was simply power, doing what power did. The damage to Sandor was not incidental to his story. It was the foundation of everything that came after. Every act of contempt toward knights and their vows. Every time he named a lie for what it was. Every moment of violence committed in service of men who did not deserve it. All of it was downstream of a 6-year-old boy, whose face was held to a fire, while the men with power chose to look elsewhere. He did not emerge from childhood broken in the way that produces weakness. Clear-eyed, stripped of every illusion most people spend a lifetime acquiring, he had been shown what the world was at an early age. Most children were still being told stories about honorable knights who protected the innocent. He trained with weapons because weapons were what the world understood. Formidable was the only protection available to him. So formidable was what he became. The manner he developed was blunt to the edge of cruelty, contemptuous of pretension, allergic to the performances of honor that surrounded him. This was not inherent meanness. Performance had covered his brother's crime, and he had learned to hate it the way a burned man hates fire. So in the end, he detested both. Training in something you despise produces a kind of bitterness. Every technique mastered is also an argument against itself. Sandor Clegane spent his formative years becoming extraordinarily good at the craft of war. The footwork, the blade work, the management of weight and distance and timing that separates a fighter from a man who merely owns a sword. He did it all inside an institution whose entire identity he had already learned to regard as a fraud. He was trained in the arts of knighthood without ever being a knight. This was deliberate. The vows were words. The ceremony was theatre. He had watched a knight hold a child's face to a brazier and receive rewards for his service in the years that followed. No amount of tradition or ceremony was going to make him put his knees on a floor and swear oaths to a system that had already shown him what it was worth. So he fought without the title. And in doing so, he became something the knightly world found more uncomfortable than an ordinary knight. He was a man who was better at everything knights were supposed to value. He wore his refusal to join them like a deliberate insult, because that is exactly what it was. His skill eventually became something beyond skill. There was a rawness to the way Sandor fought, an absence of tournament polish that made him extraordinarily difficult to read. He did not fight for form or the appreciation of spectators. He fought to end things through the most direct available means. That directness was something formal training struggled to prepare men for. Knights learned to fight other knights. Sandor learned to fight anyone, in any circumstances, without the comfort of rules. By the time he was a young man, his reputation was established enough that the question of his future service was not really a question. The Lannisters already owned House Clegane in every way that mattered. It was a short distance from there to direct service. He became Joffrey Baratheon's sworn shield. The appointment had a logic that had nothing to do with sentiment. Joffrey needed protection, and he needed someone whose loyalty was to the task, rather than the politics surrounding it. He needed someone who could not be bought away by rival houses or recruited into the court's endless faction games. Sandor's contempt for the court was, in its own way, a qualification. He was not going to be seduced by anything King's Landing had to offer. He did the job efficiently, professionally, without affection for the boy he guarded. Placed somewhere, he stood there. Threats arose and were removed. Nothing he said was untrue, a habit that in the gilded air of King's Landing made him seem almost deranged by contrast. The court ran on performance, on careful language, managed impression, the distance between what was said and what was meant. Sandor operated in that environment the way a stone operates in silk. His contempt for knights specifically was targeted and precise, grounded in observation. He watched them perform their roles in court and in the tournament grounds and saw what he had always seen. He saw men using honorable language to dress up dishonorable realities, men whose vows existed to be cited rather than followed. He said so regularly, without softening it, for whoever was listening. Every knight who performed honor was, to Sandor, performing the same system that had covered his brother's crime. Sansa Stark arrived in King's Landing with her father. She represented everything Sandor had trained himself to regard with suspicion. She was young, deeply invested in the stories she had been raised on, genuinely believing in knights and honor. She believed in the way that only survives in people who have not yet been shown what hides beneath the veil of chivalry. She saw the court and saw a story she recognized from songs. She saw Sandor and was frightened. That was the reasonable response. He looked as every bit as dangerous as he truly was. But her fear had a quality he noticed. It was honest, unperformed, uncalculated. In a court full of people deploying emotions as strategic tools, Sansa's terror of him was simply real. She was not afraid because it was useful. She was afraid because he was frightening, and he could appreciate the honesty in that. His position with Joffrey clarified itself quickly. He was the prince's shield, not his conscience. Joffrey had no use for a conscience, and showed signs of this early. Those signs sharpened rapidly as he grew more certain of his own power. He was cruel in the way that certain people become cruel when given absolute authority with little to no repercussions. He was impulsive, theatrical, and constitutionally unable to distinguish genuine deference from performed deference. The difference had never mattered to him. Sandor served him without illusion. He was a sword in the hand of a boy who should not have been trusted with a sword, and yet he served anyway. The alternative was not freedom. It was irrelevance, the absence of any structure within which a man of his configuration could exist. House Clegane served the Lannisters. Sandor served the prince. He lived inside that architecture with open eyes. This is the central irony of his King's Landing years. He despised the system more clearly than almost anyone within it. He saw the corruption, the gap between oath and reality, with a precision most courtiers could not match. And yet he served it. He was one of its most effective instruments. The man most qualified to condemn the machinery of power was also one of the machinery's most reliable components. He had been damaged in a way that made him perfect for a role he hated. The role provided the only stability available to a man damaged such as he was. To leave was to lose the only structure in which he functioned. To stay was to be complicit in everything he despised. He stayed, and the cost of staying was a kind of ongoing internal corrosion. It was the price of being conscious of your own complicity, without a clear alternative to it. He managed it through honesty, through the refusal to pretend even when pretending would have been easier. He was the Hound, but somewhere beneath that, he was still Sandor Clegane. Something small and almost accidental prevented the distance between those two things from closing entirely. Flickers of genuine perception kept breaking through the performance of indifference. He was a weapon that watched. He registered the difference between honest fear and performed fear, between genuine cruelty and performed authority. In King's Landing, those observations were accumulating. He did not yet understand that they were evidence of something still alive inside him, but they were there. The tournament, held in honor of Eddard Stark's appointment as Hand of the King, was exactly the kind of event King's Landing staged with practiced brilliance. Color and spectacle were designed to make power look like celebration. Knights rode from across the realm. The crowd pressed against the barriers and cheered. For a few days, they felt that they lived in a world where the stories were true and the men in armor were what their armor suggested. Sandor Clegane watched all of it from his position near the prince with the expression of a man attending his own sentencing. He competed because refusing would have required an explanation he had no interest in providing. The tournament was not his natural environment. It was too ceremonial, too dependent on the performance of chivalric values he considered decorative. But he was capable within it, and capability was the only currency he had ever trusted. The moment that defined the tournament was not his own performance, but an intervention. Sir Loras Tyrell had won his earlier bouts with the effortless grace that made crowds love him. He was the tournament knight perfected, beautiful and beloved, the living embodiment of everything the song celebrated. He was also, in Sandor's estimation, a man whose horse had been perfumed to unsettle Gregor's stallion. It was a tactical manipulation dressed up in flowers and smiles. Gregor lost that bout. He killed his horse on the field in rage, then turned on Loras with his sword. The tawny grounds shifted instantly from celebration to the frozen horror of watching something real break through the surface of something performed. Gregor was moving toward Loras with genuine killing intent, and the crowd that had been cheering went very quiet. Sandor stepped between them. This was not heroism. It was not sentiment. It was something more immediate. It was a response to his brother that was as close to a direct challenge as the circumstances allowed. It was a refusal to stand aside while Gregor did, in public, what he had always done in private, protected by the same silence that had always protected him. He fought Gregor to a standstill until the king's command stopped the contest. The crowd cheered Sandor as a hero. He accepted this with visible contempt. They had not understood what they had actually witnessed. Not a noble intervention, but two brothers enacting something ancient and unresolved in front of people who thought they were watching a tournament. Sansa Stark thanked him afterward. It was a genuine gesture, uncoached, the natural response of someone who had seen a frightening thing stopped. He received it with the awkward brusqueness of a man who had thoroughly foreclosed the possibility of being seen as anything other than threatening. Genuine warmth arriving in his direction had nowhere to land, but he noticed her. She was not a threat to be monitored or an obstacle to be managed. She was a person who looked at the court and still saw the story rather than the machinery. That quality, which should have made him more contemptuous of her, instead produced something closer to uncomfortable recognition. He had known what the court was before he arrived. She was learning it in real time, and the learning was going to cost her. He could see that clearly from his position at the edge of it all. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that was its own form of slow damage. Joffrey's cruelties toward Sansa began as the casual demonstrations of a boy discovering his own power. They deepened into something systematic as he grew certain no consequence would follow. He humiliated her publicly and privately, using his Kingsguard to enforce indignities that their oaths of knighthood existed, in theory, to prevent. The knights obeyed. The vows accommodated. The system worked exactly as Sandor had always known it worked. He stood and watched much of it from his position as Joffrey's shadow. This part of his King's Landing years resists clean interpretation, and it should. Most of what Joffrey did to Sansa, he did not stop. Some of it he enforced. Present for the worst of it, complicit by proximity, implicated by continued service, he was unable or unwilling to draw a line that would have ended his position and changed nothing about Joffrey's behavior. He was not her protector in those months. He was her tormentor's shadow. The fact that he watched with discomfort rather than satisfaction did not change what he was. He watched, though. He saw her absorb each humiliation and remain standing. He saw her learn rapidly and without formal instruction the survival skills of the court. He saw how she managed her expressions, how she gave answers that were technically true without being dangerous. He saw how she presented the expected surface without surrendering the self underneath. She was being remade by King's Landing the way metal is remade by heat. Unlike metal, she was conscious of the process and making choices within it. He respected that. He would not have used that word and would have denied it if asked, but it was genuine recognition of capacity. It was an acknowledgement of someone functioning effectively under conditions designed to break them. The riot changed something. It began with Joffrey's procession through a city that was hungry and desperate, and had been given ample reason to resent the throne above it. When the procession moved through the streets, it moved through that resentment, and the resentment eventually became action. The crowd turned violent. In the chaos, Sansa was separated from whatever protection the situation theoretically afforded her. The crowd that found her had no interest in her safety. Sandor found her first. He pulled her out. Not gracefully, not gently, but with the brute pragmatism of a large man removing a smaller person from immediate danger. He got her somewhere the crowd was not. In the held moment of aftermath, something happened that had no precedent in his life in King's Landing. She looked at him and did not look away. Not because she had stopped being afraid. The fear of the riot was still raw in her face. But she looked at him as a person rather than a threat, as someone who for the first time in a long time had just shown her something close to kindness. She gave him a quality of genuine attention he had almost no experience of receiving. He told her about the fire, not as a confession. He told her about fear, specifically his own. He told her that a man could be genuinely feared by others and also genuinely afraid himself. He told her that the burned face which terrified people was the evidence of his own terror rather than the absence of it. He was not gentle about it. He was not performing vulnerability. He was being honest in the way he was always honest, without softening, without managing her reaction. But he said it. He told her something true about himself that he told no one. And the fact that he told her revealed something he had been successfully obscuring for years. He was lonely, not in a simple or sentimental way, not in a way he would ever acknowledge. But the loneliness was there in the way it is always there in people who have foreclosed connection long enough that they have forgotten what connection felt like. He was not healed by it. He went back to standing at Joffrey's side the next day, but the crack was there now, visible to both of them. Joffrey's cruelty towards Sansa escalated after the riot. He had her beaten by his Kingsguard in the throne room, in public, in front of the assembled court. The knights carried out the order. They hit a girl in a throne room while the boy who commanded it watched with satisfaction. Tyrion Lannister arrived and stopped it. Sandor offered Sansa his cloak. It was a small gesture, a piece of fabric offered to a person who had just been stripped of dignity in the most public way possible. But it was genuine, unordered, coming from the man rather than the role. King's Landing produced between them not friendship, not any clean emotional category, but a thread of genuine recognition running underneath the official structure of their relationship. He was her tormentor's instrument. He was also the person who had pulled her from the riot and offered his cloak and told her about fire in the dark. Both things were true simultaneously, and Sansa was too intelligent not to hold both truths at once. Beneath the surface, King's Landing was deepening the corrosion ongoing since childhood. Every day in Joffrey's service was another day of being the weapon, the Hound, while carrying the growing awareness that he was capable of something else. He had no clear path to becoming it. The cage he lived in was not made of iron. It was made of identity, of role, of everything he had been built to be. The world had no structure in which Sandor Clegane, uncategorized, undefined by violence and service, had a place to stand. So he stayed. He watched. The crack in the armor widened imperceptibly day by day. He was waiting, without knowing it, for the thing that would finally break the structure entirely. The wildfire would provide it. Stannis Baratheon's fleet appeared at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush in the darkness before dawn. King's Landing prepared to receive it the way a city prepares for its own destruction. It was the controlled panic of people who have known something was coming and spent the intervening time hoping it would not. The defences had been arranged by Tyrion Lannister with a clarity the rest of Joffrey's court was incapable of providing. The chain across the harbour, the wildfire cached in the holds of a single ship, positioned among Stannis' fleet as it advanced up the river. Defending King's Landing against a superior force required not conventional warfare, but something that bypassed it entirely. Sandor fought in the early stages with the efficiency that had defined his entire martial life. He was placed where he was placed, did what was required, with the flat competence of a man who had been fighting since childhood and found the work neither glorious nor particularly interesting, simply problems to be solved with available tools. Men came at him and he dealt with them. Then the river caught fire. Tyrion's wildfire detonated among Stannis' fleet with a force no one present had any framework for absorbing. It was not fire in any ordinary sense. It burned on water, clung to everything it touched, and consumed ships and men with indiscriminate thoroughness. It turned the Blackwater Rush into something that should not exist. A river of green flame stretching from bank to bank. It filled the air with heat and the smell of burning that carried something specific beneath the ordinary smell of smoke and wood. The smell of burning flesh. Sandor stopped. Something in him encountered the fire across the water and the heat moving toward him on the wind. The mechanism keeping him functional simply failed. not because he was a coward, not because the danger exceeded his capacity, but because fire was not, for Sandor Clegane, an ordinary danger. Fire was the first thing, the foundational fact of his existence, the original wound from which everything else had grown, the substance that had remade his face and his life when he was 6 years old. He could not be rational about fire. The nearest he had come to managing it was controlled distance, never close, never surrounding, never between him and the only exit. The Blackwater presented fire on every side, fire without limit, fire consuming the horizon and the river and the air itself. The part of him that governed rational response was simply not available. The men around him saw a fighter freezing and called it cowardice, because cowardice was the only framework they had. They did not understand what they were actually seeing. A person encountering the shape of his own destruction. Tyrion confronted him. The exchange was brief and unsparing. Sandor told him, with the flat certainty of a man who has passed beyond the point where social consequence has any purchase, that he was not going back into the fire. He was done. The word came out with the weight of something building for a very long time. It had found, in the chaos of battle and flame, the first moment where its ordinary constraints had been removed. He was not simply refusing a battle order. He was refusing the entire structure that had kept him at Joffrey's side. He was refusing the role of the Hound, refusing the cage King's Landing had built around him. The fire had burned through the last of whatever had been holding that structure together. Done with the battle. Done with the king. Done with all of it. But he did not leave immediately. One thing pulled at him hard enough to delay departure. The fact that it pulled at him said more about who he actually was than anything that had happened in the battle. He went to Sansa's chamber. He arrived still carrying the battle. The heat, the smell, the remnants of the terror the wildfire had produced. He stood in her room, armed and agitated, and clearly outside the normal parameters of his function. She was frightened, which was the reasonable response to a large armed man appearing in your chamber in the middle of a battle. He made no effort to soften his presence. He told her he was leaving. Then he offered to take her with him. The offer was not calculated. It did not emerge from strategy or any clear understanding of what taking her north would involve. It emerged from the part of him that had been watching her for months. He had built the understanding that she was a person being consumed by a system that would not stop consuming her until there was nothing left. He had the capacity to remove her from that system. He was leaving anyway. The offer was, in the terms available to Sandor Clegane, an act of genuine care. It was undecorated, unperformed, offered without any of the language of protection that would have made it recognizable to someone looking for those signals. She refused. She was afraid of him. She did not trust that outside the structure of King's Landing, the large, terrifying man with the burned face would be something other than a large, terrifying man with a burned face. The court had given her legitimate reasons to fear him. The offer, genuine as it was, came without any reassurance that might have made it feel safe to accept. He received her refusal with the expression of a man absorbing one more confirmation of something he had always known. The world did not have a place for what he was trying to offer. The years spent as the Hound contaminated any genuine offer of kindness that he was able to make. He left the chamber. He left the city next, and then it was done. Gone from King's Landing alone, without ceremony, without the formal dissolution of his service. He simply stopped being the Hound and walked away into a realm burning itself apart, with no direction and no plan. Liberation and purposelessness are the same condition viewed from different angles and Sandor was not equipped to tell them apart. He had been the Hound for so long that he had almost no access to anything underneath it. The contempt, the violence, the refusal to perform any of it, these were genuine, not simply the role. But the role had also been a container for all of that, a way of being in the world that, however miserable, was at least coherent. Without it, he had skills entirely oriented toward serving power. He had a reputation that made him recognizable to everyone who might hire him and feared by everyone he might approach. And he had the burned face that preceded him everywhere. No direction, no purpose, no one. The fire at the Blackwater had done what no amount of years in Joffrey's service had quite managed. It had broken the Hound completely, exposed the limit beneath all the competence and contempt. Underneath the most feared fighter in King's Landing was a man with a wound so old and so foundational that no amount of skill or reputation had ever touched it. And now, finally, everyone knew it. He rode north into the darkness while the city burned behind him. The Riverlands in the third year of the War of the Five Kings was not a place that rewarded aimlessness. It was a landscape being systematically destroyed by armies that had long since abandoned any pretense of fighting each other. They had settled into the more sustainable business of destroying everything between them. Villages burned on both sides of every river, crops gone in an afternoon. The small folk who had not fled were surviving at the absolute minimum. They were hiding what little they had, moving at night, trusting no one carrying a sword. Into this landscape rode Sandor Clegane, alone, with no allegiance to declare and no destination to ride toward. He was recognizable. That was the immediate problem. The name traveled faster than any horse, and in every village and every inn the question of who he was resolved itself almost immediately. He was the Hound. He had served the Lannisters, served Joffrey specifically. In a region being destroyed by Lannister armies, that history was not a recommendation. He managed it the way he managed everything, without softening, without constructing a more palatable version of himself. He was what he was. He kept moving. He took what he needed when he needed it, justified by the logic of a collapsed social order. Immediate necessity, the absence of any functioning authority that might call the taking a crime. He was not noble about it. He did not perform regret. This sat within him the way the other compromises of his life always had, acknowledged, unresolved, filed alongside everything else. He was, in this period, almost entirely without purpose. His entire life had been organized around his role as the Hound, the specific and demanding task of being useful to powerful people in violent ways. Even the misery of King's Landing had been purposeful misery that knew where it was going. He was moving without direction, skilled but with nothing to apply the skill to, present in a landscape that assigned him no meaning. Then he found Arya Stark. She was a child traveling alone through a war zone with a sword, which suggested either remarkable courage or desperation that had moved past calculating risk. He knew her face from King's Landing, knew her name. He knew with the immediate arithmetic of a man who understood political value that she was worth money. Specifically, the ransom her family would pay for her safe return. He took her captive. Not gently, not with explanation. He grabbed her, controlled her, made clear she was going where he was going. He began riding north toward the Twins, where Robb Stark's army was camped and the ransom was waiting. Arya's response was not the response of someone who had accepted captivity. She was furious in the way that people are furious when fury is the last instrument they have and they are not prepared to put it down. She hated him specifically and named the reasons. The Hound, Joffrey's dog, the man who had served the king who killed her father. She carried a list of names, people she wanted dead, and his name was on it. She recited it with the dedication of someone using ritual to manage something too large to manage any other way. He did not attempt to correct her assessment. He was not interested in her forgiveness and did not pretend to deserve it. What he offered instead was something she had encountered very rarely. It was the truth, delivered without management, without calculation about what she wanted to hear. He told her things as they were. He made no claims about his own virtue. The honesty was disorienting. She had been moving through a world of performers for so long that encountering someone who said what was true without apparent concern for the consequences was almost more difficult to navigate than familiar manipulation. She was correct not to trust him, but she was beginning, against her own preferences, to register him as something different from the other dangerous people she had encountered. Their arrangement was predicated on complete honesty about what it was. He was not her friend or her protector. He had taken her captive for profit, and she was going along because the alternative was worse. Both of them understood this. He talked to her the way he talked to everyone, directly, without cushioning, with the assumption that she could receive the truth and did not require protection from it. He told her about fighting and survival and the specific pragmatics of staying alive in a world trying very hard to kill everyone in it. He told her things that were not comforting. He told her things that were true. She listened. She pretended not to, maintaining the posture of someone with no interest in anything this particular person had to say. But she listened because the information was useful. She had learned that useful information came from wherever it came from, and the character of the source did not diminish its value. The roads they traveled showed them everything the war had produced between the armies. Bodies on roadsides, villages reduced to foundations, people moving with the hunched manner of those who had learned that visibility was danger. The war was not abstract here. It was the smell of smoke and the absence of livestock and the faces of people who had already lost everything. Sandor moved through it with the flat acceptance of a man for whom the world's cruelty was not a surprise. The Riverlands was simply a more visible version of what was always true. Power destroyed what it touched. The small folk paid for the ambitions of lords with their homes and their futures. The machinery of war ground along without reference to the suffering it produced. He did not voice this as philosophy. He voiced it as fact, in the same tone he used for everything. Arya absorbed it into the growing collection of true things she was accumulating about how the world functioned. The dynamic between them was not warmth, or not what warmth usually looks like. It was something more unusual. A mutual recognition of reality, an agreement to be honest with each other in a world that had been relentlessly dishonest with both of them. She hated what he represented. He had no illusions about what he was. Within that mutually acknowledged set of facts, something functional and genuine existed. He was teaching her, though not deliberately, and not with any clear intention of producing a particular result. The things he told her about survival and combat and the real mechanisms of the world were forming her in ways that would outlast the Riverlands. They would outlast him, outlast almost everything that came next. She was learning from the most honest person she had encountered since her father. The twins were ahead. Robb Stark's army was there, and the ransom waiting at the end of this road was the closest thing he had to a future. It was enough of a plan for a man who had learned not to plan too far ahead, because the distance had a way of eliminating plans. The Riverlands continued to burn. The road continued north. and between the enormous man and the small, fierce girl, something was building that neither of them would have chosen and neither could have prevented. It was the slow, unwilling, entirely genuine formation of something that was not care or affection, but was adjacent to it. He was still riding toward a ransom, but the ransom was beginning to matter less than he had anticipated. The Brotherhood without banners operated in the Riverlands with the specific moral clarity of people who had decided, in the middle of a war that had abandoned all moral clarity, to mean something. They rode under no king's banner, owed no lord their swords. They had appointed themselves protectors of the small folk, the people the war was destroying without reference to their preferences. They pursued that appointment with a religious conviction that was, in the most literal sense, divinely reinforced. Beric Dondarrion led them. He had been sent by Eddard Stark to bring Gregor Clegane to justice, and Gregor had killed him for it. Then Thoros of Myr had spoken words over his body, and the Lord of Light had sent him back. By the time Sandor encountered him, Beric had died and been resurrected more times than either of them could cleanly count. The accumulation of those deaths had worn something away. Not his conviction, which remained absolute, but the personal texture of him, the accumulated detail of a private self. The deaths had stripped him down to the shape of his purpose. He was less a man with a mission than a mission that had not yet finished with the man. Thoros was the other half, a red priest who had come to Westeros to convert a king, failed entirely, and found instead that the god he had been performing devotion to for years was apparently real. Apparently, that god had opinions about Beric Dondarrion specifically. He was warm where Beric was hollow, present where Beric was distant. The combination produced a leadership that was strange and genuine in equal measure. The Brotherhood found Sandor and Arya on the road, because the Riverlands were not large enough to avoid anyone you were specifically trying to avoid. He was taken. The Brotherhood had numbers and organization and purposeful coherence, and Sandor was alone on a road with a child. Arya told them who they were and what he had done. She told them about Micah, the butcher's boy killed on Joffrey's order. That killing sat at the center of her accounting of who Sandor Clegane was and what he deserved. The Brotherhood listened. Their own accounting of the Hound was not in his favor. He was put on trial. The trial the Brotherhood offered was not the kind he had any experience navigating. It was not a political proceeding where the outcome was determined before it began. It was not a formal court where the powerful protected themselves behind the language of procedure. It was a genuine attempt, however imperfect, to determine something true. He was accused of murder, specifically Micah, but more broadly, the accumulated crimes of years of Lannister service. The Brotherhood named these things and asked him to answer for them. His defense was stripped to its minimum. He had followed orders, had been a sword in a hand, and could not be held to account for the choices of the hand. It was not a satisfying defense. It was simply what was true, delivered without apology. Beric ruled that the Lord of Light would determine Sandor's guilt through trial by combat. The logic was theological, and the Brotherhood believed it completely. Sandor believed none of it. The gods, in his experience, did not intervene in the affairs of men. They did not stop 6-year-old boys from being burned. They did not prevent the guilty from being rewarded. The idea that combat would reveal divine preference struck him as exactly the kind of comfortable story people told themselves when the alternative was too bleak to absorb. The alternative was accepting that the world was governed by power rather than truth. He fought Beric anyway, because the alternative was dying without fighting. Beric was formidable. A man killed and resurrected multiple times, animated by divine conviction. He fought with the quality that people develop when they have stopped being afraid of death. That absolute commitment made him dangerous beyond what his physical condition suggested. He lit his sword on fire. For the Brotherhood, this was evidence of divine favor. For Sandor, it was something else entirely. It was fire, coming at him. In the context of everything fire meant to him, the theological implications were irrelevant. He fought through it. The terror was present. It was always present. Fire bypassed every defense he had built. But the problem in front of him was more immediate than the problem inside him. He managed the distance between those two things through the sheer necessity of staying alive. He killed Beric, and Thoros knelt over the body as the Brotherhood watched in silence. Then Beric returned, but each resurrection took something from him, leaving him more worn, less whole than before. Even so, he acknowledged Sandor's victory. The Brotherhood released him because the trial had delivered its judgment, and they had sworn to honor the result. Arya was furious, not irrationally. Her friend was dead. Sandor had killed him, and no amount of trial by combat changed that fact. Her fury was the fury of someone maintaining a moral ledger through years of loss and violence. She found its conclusions overridden by a process she had not consented to and did not recognize as legitimate. Sandor had won his freedom through combat, which was familiar. He had done it in front of people who genuinely believed in something, which was not. Beric and Thoros were not performing faith for strategic advantage. They actually believed. They had structured their entire lives around that belief. They had given up the ordinary rewards of service to ride through a burning countryside protecting people who could offer them nothing in return. Sandor's entire understanding of motivation was organized around self-interest, around the calculation that people did what served them and dressed it in convenient language. The Brotherhood did not fit that framework. They were genuinely costly to themselves in service of genuine conviction. His inability to dismiss them as simply another set of performers was unsettling in a way he did not fully process, but it sat with him afterward. He did not believe what they believed, but he was moved, slightly and involuntarily, toward confusion rather than contempt, meaning what you said was so rare in his experience that encountering was almost disorientating. Arya had tried to kill him the night before the Brotherhood encounter. A knife in the dark, aimed at the man on her list while he slept. Something within her had stayed her hand. Not mercy exactly. Something harder to name. Some hesitation that arrived without explanation. She kept his name on her list. She maintained the posture of hatred because the posture was honest. She did hate what he had done and what he represented. But something in her accounting was resisting the clean verdict. They left the Brotherhood and continued north, and the road continued to show them the war. They continued to show each other, against both their preferences, what they actually were. The twins were still ahead. Neither of them knew what was waiting there. Sound travels strangely at night, across water, through the stillness of autumn air cooling over a river. The first thing to reach them was not screaming. Screaming came later. First came music, then the wrong kind of silence that follows music stopping abruptly, then something underneath that, a confusion of noise that did not resolve into any identifiable shape until they were close enough for the shape to be unmistakable. Sandor understood quickly. He had spent his entire life reading violent situations. What was coming off the twins was the unmistakable signature of a massacre in progress. He knew what organized killing sounded like. He knew the difference between a battle and an execution. Across the water, men were not fighting. They were dying. Arya did not understand yet. She could see the banners. She could hear the chaos. Her brother and mother were in there. The natural movement of a person toward the people they love was pulling her directly toward something that would kill her. He stopped her the only way available in the time he had. He pulled her from her horse and hit her with the flat of his axe, hard enough to drop her, controlled enough not to kill her. She collapsed. He caught her. He put her over his horse and kept moving, away from the twins, into the darkness where the killers had not yet spread. This was the most unambiguous act of genuine protection in his entire story to that point. It was not complicated by profit or calculation. There was no ransom waiting on the other side of this decision. Nothing to be gained from keeping her alive that served any clear interest of his. He stopped her from riding into the Red Wedding because she would have died if he had not, and he did not want her to die. She woke to the aftermath. This was not a single dramatic revelation, but the slow accumulation of understanding. Pieces arrived one by one in the grey light of the following hours, each one worse than the last. They assembled into a picture her mind kept trying to refuse, and her intelligence kept forcing her to accept. Robb and her mother were dead. The Northern Army had been destroyed in a single night by the violation of a sacred law that was supposed to make certain spaces safe. She processed it the way she had developed for processing unbearable things. She converted grief into the colder and more manageable form of anger and added the names responsible to her list. Walder Frey, Roose Bolton. Sandor watched her absorb it and said very little. He had nothing comforting to offer, and offering nothing was more respectful than offering false comfort. He could not meet her in the experience of family loss. He had grown up without the kind of family whose destruction could hollow a person out. But he could stay. The practical question of what came next had to be answered. The twins were behind them. Riding into the north as Arya Stark, with the Red Wedding roar and Lannister power now extending effectively over the entire realm, was not a journey with an obvious destination. He had no ransom to collect. The entire premise of their arrangement had been eliminated in a single night. So he chose the Eyrie. Lysa Arryn ruled the Vale. The Vale had stayed out of the war, was defensible, geographically isolated, and managed by a woman who was family to the Starks. She might therefore provide safety and, incidentally, payment. The reasoning was mercenary in its framing, and Sandor did not pretend otherwise. But the destination was also, practically, the best available option for keeping Arya alive. The two motivations were not separable in a way that made one more real than the other. They rode east. The dynamic between them after the Red Wedding was altered in ways neither immediately named. The ransom was gone as a structure. He could not, with the intellectual honesty he applied to everything, maintain the pretense that profit was the primary reason he was keeping her alive and moving. She knew this too. The roads continued to show them a country consuming itself. They passed through the consequences of battles, the landscape of aftermath, where the fighting had moved on and left behind only what fighting produced. They saw what the Red Wedding had done to the Northerners caught outside the twins' walls. These were men who had travelled hundreds of miles to support their king, slaughtered in their camps, drunk and unsuspecting, by men they had been eating beside hours earlier. Sandor's response to the Red Wedding was not moral outrage. He was not a man who operated from conventional moral frameworks or found betrayal surprising in the abstract. Power did what power did. The Freys and the Boltons and the Lannisters had done what powerful people did when the benefits of betrayal outweighed the costs. He had always known the world worked this way, but there was something underneath his flatness about it that was not quite flatness. He had stopped her from riding in, kept her alive through the night, and was now riding toward a destination that served her more than it served him. The Red Wedding had made her an orphan in the complete sense. Father gone, mother gone, brothers gone or scattered. He understood orphanhood in its structural form, the absence of people who were supposed to be there and were not. He could not meet her in her specific grief, but he understood the shape of the absence. He did not say any of this. He rode. The coin Arya carried, given to her by Jaqen in the earlier chaos of her travels, was a detail neither of them understood the full weight of yet. She had it. She kept it. It pointed in a direction she had not yet chosen to travel. For now, it was simply a coin in a pocket, small and heavy, representing a possible future in place of all the futures the world kept eliminating around her. Robb had been the goal. Getting back to her family had been the through line, even when the through line bent through captivity and the brotherhood and the chaos of the Riverlands. Robb was the destination, and the destination was gone. They rode east toward the mountains and the vale beyond them. Behind them, the twins sat beside the river, already becoming a story. The Red Wedding, the violation of guest right, the night the war changed completely. Ahead, the mountains rose out of the morning, indifferent and permanent, older than any war, outlasting any king. He had stopped expecting things to be other than they were a long time ago. He just kept riding. The mountains of the Vale rose out of the landscape, not merely high, but hostile, as though the terrain itself had made a decision about who was welcome. The Vale had been held against armies by those mountains. It remained isolated from wars consuming everything around it, because the mountains made attacking the Vale an almost impossible task. Sandor and Arya moved through the foothills and lower passes with the efficiency of two people who had been traveling together long enough to develop a working rhythm. The small negotiations of pace and rest and food accumulate into something functioning like partnership, even when neither participant would use that word. They had been moving through dangerous terrain together for months. They knew each other's rhythms, knew what the other needed before it was asked for. The inn at the crossroads appeared in the late afternoon of a grey, cold, unremarkable day. There were horses outside. There was smoke from the chimney. Inside, the smell of food and fire and the warmth the road had been refusing them for days. Sandor registered the horses before anything else, because the horses told him things the building did not. They told him who was inside, how many, and the quality of their mounts as a rough indicator of their resources. The horses said soldiers, the kind the war had produced in quantity, men who had been part of something larger and were now operating independently. That was a polite way of describing men who were simply armed, mobile, and making their own determinations about what the remaining rules were. He recognized one of them before he was fully through the door. A Lannister soldier named Polliver that Sandor had known from his time in that service. A man whose recent history included the taking of Harrenhal. Within that, the taking of Arya's sword and using it to kill one of her friends. She had seen Polliver too. He felt the change in her before he heard or saw it. It was the specific stillness that settled over her when something shifted from the general threat of the road to a specific and personal target. She was looking at a man on her list. Sandor went in anyway. He was cold and hungry, and the horses outside did not represent a number that concerned him. He sat down and called for food and drink with the flat authority of a man who had been giving orders his entire life. Polliver came over. There was the recognition, the adjustment of manner that comes with recognizing someone whose reputation precedes them. He talked carefully, performing a camaraderie that was entirely strategic. He was offering Sandor the chance to re-affiliate with the Lannister interest, to come back in from the cold of his desertion and resume the role of useful instrument. Sandor listened with the expression he reserved for performances, flat, slightly contemptuous, waiting for something to stop. Then Polliver pushed. He made the offer feel less like an offer and more like a demand. The distinction between those two things was the kind Sandor had been making his entire life. An offer could be declined. A demand required a different response. The fight was brief and brutal and entirely without ceremony. Sandor fought the way he had always fought, efficiently, directly, with the minimum expenditure of effort required to produce the necessary result. Polliver was the last one standing. Arya had moved during the fight with the instinctive spatial intelligence she had been developing since her first lesson with a sword. She took Needle from Polliver's belt, her sword, returned now to the person for whom it had been made. She held it with the quality of someone holding something that connects them to a version of themselves they had been afraid was gone. She killed Polliver herself, slowly, with deliberation, repeating back to him the words he had said to Lomi before he killed him. She had been carrying those words since Harrenhal, and she wanted him to hear them from the other side. It was not quick. Sandor watched and said nothing, because the killing was hers to do, and he had no standing to abbreviate it. Afterward, she sat down and ate. He understood this, the appetite that follows genuine resolution, the body's uncomplicated assertion of its own needs after the mind has completed something it had been carrying. He had seen it in soldiers after battle. He recognized it in her now. The inn showed, more than anything else in their time together, the full picture of what had been building between them. He had fought her enemies. She had reclaimed her sword. They had sat down afterward and eaten without ceremony, as though the violence was simply a thing that had happened, and the meal simply the thing that followed. The ease of it was evidence of how far they had travelled together, in the literal and non-literal senses simultaneously. There was a complete absence of drama around what would have been, for almost anyone else, a set of events requiring considerable processing. Not just combat, though he had taught her things no formal instruction could have reached. He had taught her the specific knowledge of fighting in conditions where the rules had been removed. He had taught her to read terrain and people and situations, to assess threat before it became immediate, to eat when food was available and sleep when sleep was possible. He had taught her to be honest with herself about what she was capable of and what she was not. She absorbed all of it, built on it, and began developing the quality that would define her going forward. Not just the capacity for violence, but the integration of that capacity with intelligence, patience, and the willingness to wait for the right moment. That was what separated effective violence from mere aggression. The Eyrie rose above them as they climbed into the mountains. It was perched on its peak, theoretically impregnable, the seat of Lysa Arryn, the woman who had retreated into the Vale and waited for the war to exhaust itself without her. They arrived to find the gate closed. Lysa Arryn was dead. She had gone through the moon door under circumstances not yet clear to anyone outside the castle's walls. The Eyrie was in internal uncertainty, processing the loss of its ruler. Sandor received this with the expression of a man who had learned not to be surprised when the world arranged itself against him. The Eyrie had been the destination, and was now gone. The ransom had been gone for weeks. They sat down in the shadow of the mountain in silence, two people at the end of a road with nowhere else to turn. He was tired in a way that went further than physical exhaustion. It was the deep tiredness of someone who had been moving continuously through hostile conditions long enough that stopping felt dangerous. Stopping meant feeling the weight of everything set aside in order to keep moving. He had been setting things aside for years. The weight was considerable. Beside him, Arya Stark held Needle in her lap, looked at the gate, and did not speak. It was the closest thing to peace that either of them had experienced in a very long time. But of course, it would not last. Brienne of Tarth found them through the slow persistence that had defined her search from the beginning. She had spent months moving through the Riverlands, following rumors and broken trails left behind by war, refusing to abandon the oath she had made to Catelyn Stark. Eventually, that search led her to Sandor Clegane. Brienne arrived carrying a Valyrian steel sword Jaime Lannister had given her before she left King's Landing. The sword represented a promise, but to Sandor, it represented something else entirely. A Lannister blade in the hands of a stranger claiming authority over Arya gave him every reason to be cautious. Brienne judged the situation just as quickly. The Hound had once served Joffrey Baratheon. His reputation followed him everywhere, and now he stood armed beside a missing Stark girl in the middle of a war-torn countryside. From Brienne's perspective, the conclusion seemed obvious. The tension settled between them almost immediately because both believed they were protecting Arya, who herself had little patience for the conversation. Throughout her life, powerful people had argued over where she belonged while rarely asking what she wanted. Brienne spoke of promises sworn to her mother. Sandor answered with suspicion, shaped by a lifetime spent watching supposedly honorable men hide cruelty behind titles, vows, and banners. Neither trusted the other because both had spent too long surviving a world where trust carried consequences. Then the fight began. There was nothing elegant about it. No crowd watching, no heraldry, no careful ceremony to soften what violence actually looked like. The fight took place among rocks and dirt, with both of them trying to end it before exhaustion ended them first. Brienne fought with remarkable discipline. Every movement carried the precision of years of relentless training. She had spent her entire life forcing herself into a role the world insisted did not belong to her, and the effort showed in the sharpness of her technique. Sandor fought differently. The training was there, but buried beneath something harsher and far more practical. Violence for him had never existed as sport or performance. Every lesson had been tied to survival. Every mistake had consequences. He fought with the instincts of someone who had spent most of his life expecting pain. But by this point, the road had already taken a serious toll on him. Weeks of travel, injuries, poor food, and constant fighting had worn his body down long before Brienne arrived. He could still fight through pain, but exhaustion changes people slowly before it finally breaks them all at once. That moment came near the edge of the cliff. Sandor lost his footing and crashed onto the rocks below with brutal force. The fall did not kill him immediately, but the damage was catastrophic. By the time Arya reached him, he already understood what was happening to his body. He asked her to kill him. The request came without theatrics. Sandor understood pain well enough to recognize when it was no longer survivable. He knew what dying slowly on a cold hillside would become. So he gave Arya every reason she had ever needed. He reminded her who he was. Micah. The things he had done serving the Lannisters. the fear he had carried with him across the 7 kingdoms. He named the crimes she had held against him since the beginning. She listened quietly. Then she took his silver and walked away. The moment mattered because Arya had spent so long carrying Sandor's name as part of the hatred that kept her moving forward. He had existed on her list beside monsters, killers, and the people responsible for destroying her family. Yet over the course of the road, that certainty had become more complicated. She had seen his violence, but she had also seen the strange fragments of humanity buried underneath it. Standing over him now, broken beneath the cliff, she made her decision. She left him there alive. For Sandor, the moment marked the collapse of something larger than his injuries. The Hound had defined his entire adult life. It was the identity built around fear, brutality, obedience, and survival. On that hillside, stripped of his strength and left waiting beneath the cold grey sky of the Riverlands, that identity finally reached its end. The quiet isle sits in the estuary of the Trident. Accessible only at low tide across a mudflat, the river reveals twice a day. It is not a place people find by accident. It is not on the way to anywhere that travelers with destinations are trying to reach. The elder brother ran the community there with the quiet authority of a man who had arrived at his understanding of the world through suffering rather than study. He had been a knight before the war that preceded the current war, before a battle that had broken him in ways he eventually stopped trying to repair and started trying to accept. He had found the quiet isle, and the quiet isle had found him. What grew from that finding was a community built around a single premise, that men destroyed by the world could come here and stop and escape. The brothers did not ask questions about the men who arrived. This was not carelessness. It was deliberate policy rooted in the understanding that the men who found their way to the isle were there precisely because the questions the world asked had become unbearable. The world asked who you were, what you had done, whose side you were on. The isle asked only whether you could work, whether you were willing to be quiet, and whether you could extend to the other broken men around you the minimum courtesy of not making their breaking worse. It was, in the most stripped-down sense, a place of mercy. The exact mechanism of Sandor's arrival matters little. He had, by some miracle, survived the hillside. The brothers applied the skills of men who had been putting broken things back together for years, and the result, slowly and painfully, was continued existence. He worked. This was the requirement of the isle, and he met it willingly. The alternative, lying in a bed processing what had happened to him, was not sustainable. The isle had graves to dig. The brothers buried people, travelers, soldiers, the war's overflow of dead that arrived at the island's edges. The image of him as a gravedigger contains more than its surface suggests. He had spent his entire adult life producing the dead, a weapon pointed at whatever required killing. The dead he had made were numerous, spanning decades, covering the range from necessary to unnecessary in proportions that did not bear close examination. And now here he was, on a quiet island in the middle of a river, putting the dead into the ground with his own hands rather than his sword. He was not atoning. He was not performing penance in any conscious sense. He was doing what the community required and what his body could manage. He was also, for the first time in his adult life, living without violence as a daily instrument. Although this sounds simple, that is far from the case. A man who has organized his entire existence around violence does not easily discover what he is without it. The violence had been his function, his protection, his primary means of navigating a world that had shown him early it would not be navigated any other way. Without its active application, he had to find other ways of being in the world. The silence of the isle helped. The brothers maintained a discipline of quiet, not absolute silence, but the deliberate reduction of noise, the preference for doing over saying. They held the understanding that most of what men said to each other was the management of anxiety, rather than the communication of truth. Sandor had never been a talker. He had used words as instruments, sharp, directed, deployed for effect, and then put away. The isle's preference for quiet was not a discipline he had to learn so much as an environment that matched a preference he had always had. The elder brother spoke with him occasionally, in the manner of a man who had learned that the most effective conversations were the ones where the other person determined what was said and when. He did not press. He did not offer the isle's theological framework as prescription or demand. He understood that faith arrived on its own schedule, or did not arrive at all. Attempting to accelerate its arrival was more likely to produce resistance than conversion. Faith was not available to Sandor in any form he could recognize as honest, and honesty was the one standard he had never been able to compromise. The world had not shown him evidence of divine interest in human suffering. He was not going to perform a belief the evidence did not support. The model was available, though. The elder brother had been broken, and in some sense repaired. Not a return to what he had been before the breaking, but something genuinely new, shaped by the breaking. The community on the isle was built by broken men into something that functioned. It provided, within its modest scope, something real and useful. In a world Sandor had always understood as indifferent to the suffering it produced, the quiet isle was small evidence that the indifference was not total. People could take the wreckage and make something from it. The graves continued to require digging, and he continued to dig them. A large man with a hood pulled forward, working the island's soil in grey morning light. The brothers around him continued with their own work and observed their own silences. They extended to him the fundamental courtesy of the isle, which was to let him be whatever he was without requiring him to explain or justify or perform. The quiet isle is often interpreted as the place where Sandor Clegane was saved, the violence washed away, the damaged man made whole through peace and community. The accurate reading is less comfortable. The isle provided a pause in the damage, a period of genuine stillness in which the man underneath all the accumulated roles and wounds could simply exist. He was not required to be anything in particular. He was not transformed. He was not redeemed in any complete or satisfying sense. But the stopping revealed something the motion had been obscuring. There was still, after everything, a person present. Not the hound, not the weapon, not the burn boy or the cynical soldier. Something more basic and more durable. Something that had survived the fire and the many years of violence. Diminished, damaged, carrying the full weight of everything that had accumulated. But present, the island held him. The tide came and went. The graves filled with the war's dead, and he dug more, the work continuing in the rhythm that all work establishes when done long enough. The tide went out across the mudflat in the early morning, and the large man in the hood bent to his work among the graves. The world continued its motion around him while he held, for a little while longer, to the mercy of escaping. Sandor Clegane left the quiet isle because the world followed him there. The riverlands were still bleeding long after the war had supposedly moved on. Villages burned, roads remained dangerous, and men continued killing beneath whatever banner gave them permission. Sandor discovered that truth when he came across the remains of a village destroyed by men, claiming to ride with the Brotherhood without banners. He knew some of the men responsible. The Brotherhood he had once travelled beside under Beric Dondarrion had believed in something real. Rough justice, perhaps, but still justice. Beric had held the group together through sheer conviction. Without him, parts of the Brotherhood had begun to rot at the edges. Some still protected the small folk. Others used the Brotherhood's name as cover for theft, murder, and revenge. Sandor tracked the men down and killed them. The violence itself came easily. That part of him had never disappeared on the Quiet Isle. What lingered afterward was the uncomfortable recognition that this time he had killed for people who could offer him nothing in return. No king had ordered it. No lord had paid him. The dead villagers had possessed neither wealth nor power. Their killers simply deserved killing. That thought stayed with him. The Brotherhood found him soon afterward. Word travelled quickly through the Riverlands, especially when violence was involved. They saw what he had done and understood immediately what kind of man stood in front of them. Sandor never swore their oaths or spoke grandly about justice, but he rode north with them all the same. Stories coming from beyond the wall were becoming impossible to ignore. Wildlings fleeing south, dead men walking, entire ranger parties disappearing into the snow. Beric Dondarrion himself had already travelled north toward whatever was gathering there. Sandor followed because the report sounded real. He had spent most of his life dismissing stories about the dead and the others as old northern fears carried forward through generations. But frightened peasants were one thing. Hardened men of the Night's Watch, describing the same horrors again and again, was another. So he adjusted to reality the same way he always had. He accepted what was in front of him and kept moving. The journey north changed very little about him on the surface. Sandor remained blunt, suspicious, and deeply uncomfortable around men who spoke too confidently about gods and destiny. But travelling beside the Brotherhood forced him into close company with people who genuinely believed they were protecting others. Years earlier, he would have mocked that kind of conviction immediately. Now, he simply watched it quietly. The Hound was gone by then. That identity had died on the hillside with Brienne and Arya, but the man underneath it had not fully figured out what came next. He rode north carrying the same scars, the same size, the same capacity for violence. The difference was direction. For the first time in his life, the path ahead felt like one he had chosen himself. Eventually, the Brotherhood reached Jon Snow's company gathering near the wall. Their mission sounded insane even before they crossed into the snow beyond it. Capture one of the dead and bring it south alive as proof of what was coming. Sandor agreed to go. The wall rose above them like something built for a different world entirely. Ancient ice stretching into the sky, holding back a threat most of Westeros still refused to believe existed. Sandor looked at it with the exhausted acceptance of a man who had already seen too many impossible things to dismiss another. The gate opened. Cold air rolled through from the other side, carrying something deeper than winter. Sandor stepped forward into the snow and kept walking. The plan was simple, and it was very nearly suicide. Walk out past the wall, into the dead lands, and bring back one of the dead, a single walking corpse, captured and bound, to carry south as proof. The lords and queens of the realm would not believe in an army of the dead on the word of a few northern men. So a small band went out to catch one of those corpses and drag it into the light, where it could not be denied. Sandor Clegane was one of those men. He had no real stake in the politics of it. He did not care which ruler ended up convinced, or which throne the proof was meant to save. He went because the thing was real. He had seen the dead with his own eyes, and there was work in front of him that needed men who would not run from it. That was the whole of his reasoning. By this point in his life, it was enough. The party that walked out beyond the wall was small and badly matched. A few seasoned fighters, a few wildlings, a couple of men of faith who believed they had been kept alive for some purpose, and Sandor, who believed in nothing of the kind. They moved north into a white country with no horizon, where the cold was its own kind of enemy and the silence carried for miles. They were hunting a single dead man. What found them instead was the whole host. The dead came in numbers that made fighting pointless. The living ran, and the land funneled them onto a frozen lake, out to a low island of rock at its center. There they made their stand, because there was nowhere else to go. The ice around the island had cracked under the weight of the dead, and the open water held the corpses back. For a night and most of a day, that thin margin of black water was all that kept the party alive. It was a brutal way to wait. The men sent a runner back toward the wall to beg for help that might never come. The rest of them sat in the open cold, ringed by an army that did not feel cold, did not tire, and did not leave. One of the men of faith had been wounded badly before they reached the rock. Through the night, the cold and the wounds took him. He did not die in battle. He died quietly, in the dark, the way most men actually die, worn down rather than struck down. They had no time to mourn him and no ground to bury him in. It was Sandor, in the end, who broke the standoff, and not on purpose. He had never been a patient man. Hours of sitting and waiting and watching dead faces stare across the ice wore on him in a way that danger never had. So he picked up a stone and threw it at the nearest corpse, out of pure frustration. The stone struck the thing and bounced off, and then it skittered out across the surface of the lake and did not break through. The water had frozen solid in the night. The margin of safety was gone, and the dead understood it the moment the stone slid clean across the ice. The whole host came forward at once. What followed was not a battle anyone could win. It was a handful of living men with steel against an enemy that did not stop when it was cut down and rose again when it was knocked flat. Sandor fought the way he had always fought, without flourish, without fear, swinging at whatever came into reach and holding his patch of ground because the men beside him needed it held. There was no glory in any of it. There was only the work and the cold and the slow understanding that the work was about to be the last thing he ever did. Then the sky opened with fire. The Dragon Queen had heard the call for help and come north herself, and her dragons fell on the dead like a storm. Fire rolled across the ice in great sheets, and the host that had seemed endless burned in heaps. For a moment it looked like a rescue, clean and complete. The living climbed onto the dragon's back, and the slaughter on the ground turned in their favor. That was when the dead king made his answer. He took a spear of ice and threw it across the open air, and it struck one of the 3 dragons clean through. The great creature folded and fell, smoking, into the frozen lake, and the ice closed over it. In one throw, the dead had taken something no one had ever managed to take from her. The cost of the rescue was a dragon, and the dead were not finished with it yet. In the chaos, Jon Snow went into the water and was left behind as the dragon carried the others away. He should have died there. What saved him was a figure out of his own family's past. An uncle, long thought dead, himself caught somewhere between the living and the dead, who rode out of the white waste at the last moment. The uncle put the man on his own horse, turned to face the host alone, and bought the escape with whatever was left of his life. He did not ride out again. The living got their man back because a dead one chose to stand in the gap. And through all of it, the thing they had come for held. The corpse they had captured was bound and sacked and dragged the whole way, and it survived the burning lake and the long retreat to the coast. The mission, against every reasonable expectation, succeeded. They had walked out to fetch a single dead man as proof, and they came back with him, having paid for him with a dragon, with the man of faith left frozen on the rock, and with an uncle's second death in the snow. It was a victory measured entirely in what it had cost. Here is the thing worth marking about Sandor in all of this. He was not the hero of it. He led nothing. He saved no one with a grand gesture. And the one thing he did on his own initiative, throwing that stone, nearly killed them all. His part was simpler and harder than heroism. He was a competent man doing necessary work, holding his ground so that something that needed to be carried south could be carried south. He had spent most of his life as a weapon pointed at whatever target a powerful man chose. Out on that ice for once, he was a weapon pointed at the right thing, by his own choosing, for no reward at all. That is not the same as glory. It is better than glory, quieter, and it is the closest thing to purpose his life had yet allowed him. The proof made it south. It changed less than they had hoped, but the larger machine was already in motion, and it could not be stopped now. The dead king raised the fallen dragon from the bottom of the lake and turned it to his own purpose. With it, the wall that had stood for thousands of years, the one barrier between the living and the dead, came down at last. After that, there was no more waiting and no more margin. The dead were coming south into the world of the living, and every road now ran toward a single place where the matter would be settled. Sandor had survived the frozen lake. What waited beyond it was the longest night the world had ever faced. Winterfell became the place where the living gathered to make its stand. The northern lords, the wildlings, the Dragon Queen's armies, the men who had fought beyond the wall. All of them pulled back behind those grey walls to wait. It was not a hopeful place. Everyone in it understood the arithmetic. The army marching toward them did not eat, did not sleep, did not fear, and grew larger with every soul it killed. Sandor Clegane came south with the rest of them. As ever, he led nothing and commanded no one. He was one more sword on a wall, which suited him well enough. What he had not expected was to find the girl there. The last time he had seen Arya Stark, she had left him broken at the bottom of a hillside and walked away. He had wanted death then, and she had denied it to him, and he had spent years becoming a man she would not have recognized. Now they stood in the same courtyard, on the same side, both of them changed past easy recognition. She was not the half-feral child he had dragged across the riverlands. She had become quiet and certain and very dangerous, and she carried it lightly. He saw it at once. A man who has spent his life around killers knows another one when she walks past. There was no reunion in the warm sense of the word. They were not built for that, either of them. But something passed between them that neither had with anyone else alive. He had been the closest thing to a protector she had once had, and she had been the closest thing to a reason he had once found. They looked at each other across a courtyard full of frightened people, two survivors of the same long road, and they recognized what they had each become. That recognition was its own kind of reunion. It did not need to be spoken. Before the battle, another man tried to speak to him about meaning. Beric Dondarrion had died and been brought back more times than he could properly count. He had come to believe that a man does not return from death without a reason, that the fire kept him alive for a purpose he had not yet finished serving. He looked at Sandor, a man who had also walked off a hillside that should have killed him, and saw the same hand at work. He believed they had both been kept in the world to do something on this night. Sandor had no patience for that kind of talk. He did not believe in the fire god, or in destiny, or in any plan laid out for him by powers above. He had survived because very large men sometimes survive what should kill them, and for no grander reason than that. He said as much in his blunt way and let the matter drop. But the idea did not leave him entirely. It sat somewhere at the back of him, unwelcome and unanswered, waiting for the night to make its argument. Then the dead arrived, and there was no more time for talk. They came in the dark and the cold, in numbers that turned the field before Winterfell into a single moving mass. The defenders lit what fires they could. Trenches were set ablaze to hold the line, and great walls of flame went up around the castle as the host pressed in. Fire was one of the few weapons that worked against the dead. It was also the one thing in the world that Sandor Clegane could not face. And so, in the middle of the worst battle the living had ever fought, the Hound stopped fighting. We have seen this in him before. At the Blackwater, when the river burned green and the fire took the men around him, something inside him simply gave out, and he walked away from a battle he could not stand to be in. It would be easy to call this the same failure happening twice. It is not. It is something harder and more honest than that. The truth is that the wound never closed. The brazier his brother held him over as a child was still burning in him decades later, and no amount of survival had put it out. He had not been cured of fire. He had only learned to live alongside it, most of the time. On this night, surrounded by walls of flame and an enemy that could not be killed, the old terror rose up and took him, and he sat down against a wall in the dark and could not move. Beric found him there. The man who believed in purpose was already dying, wounded, burning, running on whatever was left. He did not lecture Sandor about destiny now. He simply refused to let him stay down. He pulled at him, pushed at him, dragged him back toward his feet by sheer insistence. It was not the words that moved Sandor in the end. It was Arya. Somewhere in the chaos, the girl was alone and hunted, the dead closing on her through the corridors of the castle. The moment Sandor understood that, the paralysis broke. The thing that got him off that wall was not faith and not courage. It was her. He had failed to be many things in his life. He would not fail to be the man between Arya and the dead. He moved after that. The three of them, Sandor, Beric, the girl, fought their way through the inside of the castle, room by room, as the dead poured through every door. Sandor did the work he had always been good at, clearing a path, holding the gaps, keeping the corpses off her back so she could keep moving. He had spent his whole life as a weapon in someone else's hand. Here, in the dark of a dying castle, he was a weapon of his own choosing again, and the thing he had chosen to defend was a girl who no longer needed defending. The end came in a narrow place, with the dead pressing in from both sides. Arya was nearly taken. There was no room to fight clear and no time to reach her. And Beric Dondarrion, already wounded past saving, already burning through the last of his returns, put himself in the gap. He stood between the girl and the dead and took everything that came, holding them back with his own body long enough for Sandor to pull her through a door and bar it. He did not survive it. He had nothing left to come back from this time. He had spent his last life buying 2 breaths of safety for someone who was not his blood and owed him nothing. Sandor watched it happen, and it landed on him in a way that almost nothing in his life had ever landed. Here is why it mattered so much to a man like him. Sandor Clegane had grown up in a world where power protected the cruel and the strong used the weak, and no one died for anyone if there was a cheaper way out. He had never once seen a man lay down his life freely for someone else, expecting nothing in return. It had never been shown to him. It was not part of the world he had been raised in. And now he had seen it. A dying man choosing, with full knowledge, to spend the end of his life shielding a girl he barely knew. Sandor had no language for it, but he understood, watching Beric fall, that he had just witnessed the thing he had spent his whole life insisting did not exist. That is the night Sandor began, dimly and against his own stubbornness, to wonder whether there might be a reason to be alive after all. He still would not use Beric's words. He still rejected the fire god and the talk of purpose and the idea that some plan had spared him. But he had been kept in the world long enough to stand in that corridor and to see what a man could choose to die for, and to be the one who carried the girl out alive. Whatever you wanted to call that, it was not nothing. The long night ended before the sun came up. The dead fell all at once, the way a thing falls when its heart is cut out, and the living were left standing in the ruin of what they had held. Sandor was among the ones still breathing. He had not been cured of his fear, and he never would be. He had simply chosen, one more time, to keep moving. And this time, he had kept moving for someone other than himself. When the dead were gone, and the living counted what was left of themselves, the war simply turned and pointed in a new direction. There was still a queen on the Iron Throne, and there were still scores to settle, and so the survivors of the long night gathered themselves and marched south. The threat that had nearly ended the world was finished. The smaller, older business of who would rule the ruins went on as if it had never paused. Sandor Clegane rode south with the army, and riding beside him, as if no time had passed at all, was Arya Stark. There is a weight to this, and it is worth slowing down for. These two had shared a road once before. Years earlier, after the slaughter at the Twins, Sandor had taken the girl across the Riverlands as a half-prisoner and half-charge, the two of them snarling at each other over every mile. That road had been loud. She had hated him and feared him, and learned from him without wanting to. He had protected her without admitting he was doing it. They had been 2 damaged strangers chained together by circumstance, with nothing in common but the will to keep breathing. This road was quiet. They did not bicker now. There was not much left to say, and they had both grown into people who said less. The girl who had once filled the silence with threats and questions had become a woman who could sit inside silence for hours. The man who had answered her with contempt had run out of contempt somewhere along the way. They rode south the way old soldiers ride, side by side, comfortable in a quiet that would have been impossible between them before. They were not the same 2 people who had walked away from the Twins. They were what those 2 people had slowly become. It would be wrong to call what was between them love or family in any ordinary sense. Neither of them had words for it, and neither would have used them. But it was the closest thing to family he had left in the world. He had no one. What they had was a shared history of a long road and a great deal of blood, and the strange truth that each had once spared the other's life when it would have been easier not to. That was their bond. It was made entirely of hard things, and it held. There is a detail here that says everything about how far they had come. Arya kept a list of the people she meant to kill before she died, names she had recited to herself for years. Over the seasons, that list had grown shorter as one by one she crossed the names off. And once, long ago, the name on that list had been his. She had wanted Sandor Clegane dead for what he had done in the early days, and she had said so to his face. Now the same girl rode south at his side. His name was long gone from her list, and the two of them were bound for the same fight. The list had shortened to almost nothing. One name still on it was the Queen waiting in King's Landing. Sandor had a name of his own that he was riding toward. He had never spoken much about what he wanted from the rest of his life, because for most of it, he had wanted nothing at all. But there was one piece of unfinished business that had sat in him since he was 6 years old, since the day his brother held his face over fire and the men around them called it an accident. Gregor Clegane was still alive, or whatever the thing wearing his brother's body could be called now. And somewhere underneath all the years and all the scars, Sandor had decided that he would settle that account before he was done. He rode south, knowing his brother waited at the end of it. He had no illusion that he would survive the meeting. He went anyway. This is the thing to understand about Sandor on this last road, and it is the difference between this man and the one who had drifted the Riverlands years before. Once, he had only ever been running. He ran from the Blackwater when the fire took him. He ran from his life, from his name, from anything that asked something of him. He had spent whole years moving with no destination, alive only because he had not yet found a reason to stop. Every road he had ever traveled had been a road away from something. This one was not. For the first time in his life, Sandor Clegane was riding towards something he had chosen. Not away from fire, not away from a battle he could not stand, not away from himself, toward his brother, toward the thing that had made him, toward the one reckoning his whole life had been pointing at without his ever admitting it. He did not expect it to save him. He did not expect to come out the other side. But a man who rides toward his own death on purpose, for a reason he has chosen himself, is a different man from one who simply wanders until the end finds him. Somewhere on the long road, without ceremony, Sandor had become the first kind, and the girl rode beside him, carrying a last name on her short list, the two of them moving south through a ruined country toward the same burning end. Then the city came into view. King's Landing rose up ahead of them at last, the great sprawl of it crowded behind its walls, the Red Keep standing over the whole of it the way it always had. Somewhere inside those walls was the queen Arya meant to kill. Somewhere inside them was the brother Sandor meant to face. The two of them sat their horses and looked at the place where both their lists would finally come to an end. And neither of them said what they were thinking. They had ridden a long way together to arrive here. Whatever waited beyond those gates, they had agreed without words to walk into it, side by side. Daenerys Targaryen had brought her dragon down on King's Landing, and the great defences of the capital had broken in an afternoon. The bells rang out across the city. The old signal of surrender, the sound that was supposed to mean the fighting was over and the lives inside the walls would be spared. The bells rang and the city surrendered, and she burned it anyway. Dragonfire rolled down the streets in waves. The stores of wildfire buried under the city for years caught and bloomed green in the dark. Stone towers came apart. The people who had rung those bells died in the fire they thought would save them. Into that, Sandor Clegane and Arya Stark walked together, because both of them had a name to settle inside the Red Keep, and neither of them had ever known how to turn back from a thing once it was begun. They pushed through streets that were no longer streets. Fire climbed every wall around them. The ground shook as parts of the city collapsed into themselves. It was, in every sense, the worst possible place in the world for a man who had spent his whole life unable to stand the sight of flame. And Sandor did not stop, and he did not break, and he kept moving through the burning city toward the keep where his brother waited. He had made his peace with the fire long enough to do this one last thing. They reached the great stair of the Red Keep as the building above them began to come apart, and there, with the whole castle shaking and burning around them, Sandor stopped the girl and would not let her go any further. This is the moment that tells you everything about what he had become. He looked at Arya Stark, and he saw himself. He saw a person who had let revenge become the whole shape of her life, who had a list of the dead-to-be that she recited like a prayer, who was about to walk up into a collapsing castle to kill a queen, and would very likely die doing it. He recognized all of it, because it was his own life looking back at him. He had spent decades being eaten alive by hatred for his brother. It had cost him everything else a man might have had. And standing on that stair, with both their reckonings just above them, Sandor decided that he did not want her to share his ending. So he told her to go. He told her to leave the city and not look back. He told her that the road he was on, the road of hate, the road that led up those stairs into the fire, ended in only one place, and that he had been walking it so long there was nothing left of him but the walking. He did not want that for her. He had taught her how to survive, how to fight, how to be hard enough to live in a cruel world. Now, at the very end, he taught her the last and most difficult thing, that she did not have to become what he was. She could choose differently. He had no choice in how he was made or how he would end. She still did, and he spent one of his last living acts making certain she understood it. That is the most complete change in the whole long arc of Sandor Clegane. The man who had cared for nothing chose at the end to want something better for someone else than he had ever managed for himself. He could see what he had made of her, and he loved her enough, in whatever broken way a man like him could love, to send her away from it. She listened. For a moment she stood there, the fire rising around them both, and then she did something she had never done before. She called him by his name, not the Hound, not the title the world had hung on him like a brand, but the name his mother might have used before any of it happened. And then she turned and walked back out of the burning castle, and she lived. He watched her go. It was the last good thing he ever did, and he knew it, and it was enough. Then Sandor climbed the stairs alone to find his brother. He met them coming down, the queen, and the towering thing that walked behind them in armor. The queen was trying to flee the castle she had doomed. The man who had built her bodyguard out of a corpse tried to keep his creation in hand, to send it on past this distraction and protect the queen's escape. But the thing behind the armor was past taking orders. It heard its brother's voice, and it turned, and whatever was left of Gregor Clegane inside that shell wanted the same reckoning Sandor had carried up the stairs. The queen slipped past in the chaos and was gone. The two brothers were left alone on the stairs, with the castle burning down around them. What Sandor faced was no longer his brother in any way that mattered. When the helm came off, the face beneath it was not a man's face at all. The thing had been dead and made to walk again, kept moving by foul work, hollowed out of whatever small humanity Gregor had ever possessed. There had never been much. Now there was none. Sandor had ridden across a burning country to settle a score with his brother, and he arrived to find that the brother was already gone, and the thing that wore his shape could not be killed the way a man is killed. The fight that followed was not a duel. There was no skill in it, no clean exchange of blows, no honor of the kind the songs pretend to. It was two enormous men trying to destroy each other in a collapsing room, and one of them could not feel pain and would not fall down. Sandor struck the thing again and again, with everything he had, in every way that should have ended it. None of it worked. Steel did not stop the thing. Wounds that would have dropped any living man did nothing. The creature took the punishment without slowing. It closed its hands around Sandor's head, the way it had crushed others before. He should have died there. By every measure of strength, his brother had him. And in that moment, with his own death in his brother's hands, Sandor understood the only thing left for him to understand, that he was not going to win. The thing could not be beaten in any way that left him standing. There was no version of this where the brother died and Sandor walked out of the fire. The score he had carried his whole life could not be settled by killing. It could only be ended by both of them ending together. So he made his choice. With the last of his strength, Sandor drove a blade into the thing's skull, into the one place that might do harm. And then, while it staggered, he did not try to escape. He took hold of his brother and threw the whole weight of both their bodies through the crumbling wall of the keep, out into the open air, down into the fire that filled the ruined city below. He chose to take them both into the flames. He carried Sandor Clegane out of the world with him, the way he had carried so much else, by force, by will, by refusing to let go. There is so much to understand in that single act. First, is that it was not a triumph. Sandor did not win his great fight. He did not stand victorious over the brother who had ruined his life. There was no triumph available to him, because the thing he was fighting was already dead, and the score was already lost. What he achieved was not victory in the ordinary sense. It was completion. The whole of his life had been pointing at that stairway since he was 6 years old. On that stairway, it finally came to its end. He did not beat his brother. He ended the two of them at once, together, in the only way that was possible. For a man whose entire existence had been shaped by a single moment of his brother's cruelty, ending that story on his own terms was the only kind of victory the world had ever allowed him. The second thing is the fire. Remember where this man started. 6 years old, his face held over a brazier. He had run from fire at the Blackwater. He had frozen before the burning trenches at Winterfell. Fire was the architecture of everything he feared, the one thing in all the world that could break him. And at the very end, he did not die running from it. He did not die in a corner, hiding from the flame the way the frightened child in him had always wanted to. He took hold of his brother and carried him down into the fire on purpose, and he died inside it. He did not die afraid of fire. He died inside it by his own hand, having walked toward it instead of away. That is the whole distance Sandor Clegane travelled in his life, measured in a single fall. The fire that had been done to him as a boy became, at the very end, the fire he chose. And the last thing is the manner of it. Sandor Clegane had spent his life being used. He was a weapon in other men's hands, pointed at whatever target served them, given no say in any of it. He had no choice in how he was made. He had no choice in the burn, in the brother, in the men who looked away. The one thing the world never gave him was agency over his own life. And in his final moment, that was the one thing he seized. He chose how he would die. Not at his brother's hand, with his skull crushed in a corner. Not slowly, not afraid, not as a victim one last time. He died moving forward into the flames, on his own terms and by his own decision. A man who had been given a choice in nothing finally took the only one that was ever left to him. The Red Keep came down around them. The two brothers fell together into the burning city, and the long, terrible account between them closed at last in the fire that had opened it. So that is how the story of Sandor Clegane ends. In fire, with his brother, in a city coming down around him. The same fire that had marked the beginning of him, closed over the end of him at last. It is worth standing back now and asking what the whole of it amounted to. The world he was born into tried to make him into one thing only, a weapon. It started when he was a child, when power decided that his suffering did not matter and his brother's cruelty did. It continued through every year that followed. Kings used him, queens used him. He was pointed at enemies and set loose, valued for exactly one quality, his willingness to do violence without flinching, and valued for nothing else. For most of his life, the world got what it wanted from him. He was a weapon. He did terrible things, and we should not pretend otherwise. The blood on him was real, and some of it was innocent, and no ending erases that. But the world did not get to keep him as only that. Somewhere along the way, slowly, and against everything that had been done to him, Sandor Clegane became something more than the thing he was built to be. Not good. We have to be careful with that word, because he never earned it and never claimed it, but more. A man who could choose, at the end, what he protected and how he died. The clearest proof of that is the girl. Arya Stark survived partly because of him. He taught her how to live in a brutal world, how to be hard, how to fight, how to keep moving when everything had been taken. That teaching kept her alive through years that killed almost everyone she loved. And then, at the very end, on a burning staircase, he gave her the one lesson he had never been given himself, that she did not have to end the way he was ending. He sent her out of the fire. She walked away from his death because he told her to, and she lived. A man who left almost nothing behind him left that. One person walking out of a burning city into the rest of her life, because the weapon the world had made decided, just once, to be something better than a weapon. The question his life poses is a hard one, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a comforting one. Can a person shaped entirely by damage choose to become something different? Can a man built out of cruelty and fear and fire ever genuinely change what he is? Sandor's answer is partial. It is incomplete. It is honest. Yes, but not fully, and not without cost. He never stopped being afraid of fire. He never undid the things he had done. He never became gentle, or kind, or whole. The damage stayed with him to the last breath. What changed was not the damage. What changed was what he chose to do while carrying it. That is a smaller transformation than the songs would want, and a truer one. Real people do not get clean redemption. They get, at best, a few hard choices made well near the end, while still dragging everything that broke them. And here is the thing that in the end made him matter. In a world full of people wearing masks, pretending to virtue they did not have, performing honor over private rot, lying to keep power, Sandor Clegane never once pretended. He told the truth about what he was, plainly and without flinching, even when the truth was ugly, especially when it was ugly. He was the only face in the whole story that never changed into something it wasn't. That honesty was the one virtue the world had not managed to burn out of him. It was, in the end, the only one he had. And it turned out to be enough to build a real change on, late and incomplete as it was. The last image to keep is the one he gave us himself. Fire and the open road. The fire that made him and ended him. And the road. The long road he walked across a ruined country, alone for so much of it, until a girl walked it beside him and gave it, for a little while, a purpose. He did not become good. He became honest about what he was, and in the end, that was enough to matter.